Emma's trembling fingers clutched the scraps she had begged for in the biting cold. Starvation had been her companion for days, but instead of eating, she did something that stunned the man watching from the shadows.
Please.
She
I
fed the only
missed you
food she
so
had to two shivering
much.
puppies in a
Are
basket.
you
That act
okay?
of pure sacrifice pierced the frozen heart of an ex-soldier who thought he was dead inside. Inviting her into his truck wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of a journey to find himself again. This story proves that sometimes the most broken souls are the ones who heal each other. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button and stay until the end. I want to see how far this story travels. Comment the city you're watching from. Now, let's begin. The biting wind whipped through the stalls of the outskirts market, carrying the scent of raw meat and exhaust fumes under a steel-gray sky that promised nothing but rain and misery. Owen moved through the chaotic throngs of the Sunday market like a ghost haunting the living, his presence demanding space even in the crush of the crowd. He was a mountain of a man, standing 6'2" with broad shoulders that seemed to carry the weight of invisible tombstones, his physique honed by years of grueling discipline as a Navy SEAL and maintained by the brutal, solitary labor of farm work. His face was clean-shaven, revealing a jawline carved from granite and a mouth that had forgotten how to smile, while his eyes, a piercing and icy shade of steel blue, scanned the perimeter with the ingrained hypervigilance of a soldier who had seen too much darkness to ever fully trust the light. He wore a faded canvas jacket that had seen better days and heavy work boots, his movements precise and economical, a stark contrast to the haggling housewives and shouting vendors around him. Since Sarah died, taking the warmth of his world with her, Owen had become a creature of silence, his interactions with humanity limited to necessary grunts and curt nods, his heart encased in a fortress of grief that repelled anyone who dared to get close. He was buying supplies not out of desire, but out of the mechanical necessity of survival, his mind drifting to the silence of his empty farmhouse until a flash of movement near the butcher's stall caught his attention and anchored him back to the grim reality of the present. A young woman stood before the butcher, her posture screaming of a desperation so profound it made Owen's chest tighten with an unfamiliar pang. This was Emma, though Owen did not know her name yet, only her evident despair. She was small, perhaps in her early 20s, but she looked like a gust of wind could shatter her into dust. Her frame was hidden beneath layers of oversized, filthy clothes that smelled of damp earth and stale fear, a woolen coat 2 sizes too big swallowing her whole. Her hair, a matted tangle of chestnut brown that had lost its shine, obscured a face that was pale and gaunt, with dark circles bruising the translucent skin beneath terrified, darting hazel eyes that constantly checked the exits as if she expected a predator to lunge from the shadows. She spoke to the butcher, a rotund and greasy man with a face red from exertion and indifference, her voice a cracked whisper as she pointed to the bucket of scraps destined for the pigs. The butcher, sneering with open contempt, tossed a paper-wrapped package of gristle and bone at her chest, barking a cruel laugh when she fumbled to catch it with trembling hands. She didn't recoil from the insult. Instead, she clutched the offal like it was gold bullion and scurried away, not towards the exit, but towards the desolate alleyway behind the market stalls. Driven by a curiosity, he thought he had buried along with his wife. Owen adjusted the brim of his hat and followed her, his boots making no sound on the cobblestones, his instincts screaming that there was more to this beggar than simple hunger. In the shadows of the damp alley, shielded from the wind by towering stacks of crates, Emma knelt beside a battered wicker basket covered with a torn blanket. Owen watched from the corner, his breath hitching as she pulled back the cover to reveal 2 puppies, no more than 4 or 5 months old, curled together for warmth. One was a male, who would later be known as Bear, with a coat of rich dark chocolate and a sturdy, blocky head that hinted at a mixed heritage of strength. Even now, despite his visible ribs and shivering frame, his eyes held a spark of intelligence and protectiveness as he watched Emma's hands. The other was a female, Luna, smaller and frailer, her fur a pale, dusty cream, her body trembling violently not just from the cold, but from a nervous disposition that made her flinch at the distant slam of a car door. Emma opened the package of meat, the smell of raw iron filling the small space, and, to Owen's shock, she did not take a bite. Instead, she tore the best pieces of meat and gristle into manageable chunks and fed them to the dogs, whispering soft, melodic words of comfort that contrasted sharply with her ragged appearance. Bear ate with polite urgency, nudging Luna to eat her share, while Emma reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of bread so stale it was nearly gray with mold. She gnawed on the dry crust, her eyes filled with tears as she stroked Luna's ears, sacrificing her own sustenance to keep the only family she had left alive for one more day. The sight cracked the ice around Owen's heart, evoking a memory of the camaraderie and sacrifice he had only ever seen in the brotherhood of his unit. He stepped out of the shadows, his large frame blocking the dim light at the end of the alley, and his voice, deep and gravelly from disuse, rumbled through the small space. "You need to eat better than that if you want to keep them alive," he said, not unkindly, but his sudden appearance shattered the fragile peace of the moment. Emma's head snapped up, her eyes widening in absolute terror as her mind, frayed by weeks of running from her father's debt collectors, registered him not as a savior but as an enforcer sent to drag her back to hell. "No, please, I don't have it," she stammered, scrambling backward, her boots slipping on the wet pavement as she tried to shield the basket with her body. She attempted to stand, to run, to fight, but the sudden movement combined with weeks of starvation caused the world to tilt violently on its axis. Black spots danced across her vision, the gray sky spun into a vortex, and her knees buckled beneath her. She didn't feel the cold impact of the ground she expected. Instead, she felt strong, calloused arms catch her before she fell, and the last thing she heard before the darkness took her completely was the fierce, protective bark of the chocolate puppy and the low, reassuring rumble of the stranger's voice promising safety, a promise she was too unconscious to hear but desperately needed to believe. Owen hoisted her effortless weight into his arms, signaled the growling bear to follow, and strode toward his truck, deciding in that instant that no one, human or animal, would starve on his watch today. Consciousness returned to Emma not as a gentle awakening but as a sudden, violent jolt of adrenaline that sat her bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was no longer on the cold, unforgiving pavement of the market alley but lay on a worn leather sofa that smelled faintly of wood smoke and old tobacco, covered by a heavy wool quilt that scratched against her chin. The room was dim, lit only by the gray, watery light filtering through dust-moted windows, revealing a space that was masculine and utilitarian, a cabin built of dark timber, sparsely furnished, and echoing with a silence so profound it felt heavy. Across the room, standing by a cast-iron wood stove that radiated a dry, comforting heat, stood the man from the market, Owen. Without the chaotic backdrop of the crowd, he seemed even larger, a looming silhouette against the window whose stillness was unnerving. He had shed his canvas jacket, revealing a gray thermal shirt that clung to the thick muscles of his arms and chest, and as he turned toward her, the firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, highlighting a small, jagged scar running through his left eyebrow, a permanent souvenir from a life of violence she could only guess at. He held a steaming mug in his large, calloused hands, his steel-blue eyes watching her with an expression that was unreadable, neither kind nor cruel, just intensely observant. Emma scrambled backward until her spine hit the armrest, her breath coming in shallow gasps as her hand instinctively flew to her neck, checking for a pulse, for life, for the collar of a debt slave. "Where are they?" she croaked, her voice raw. "If you're with them, just tell me. Don't play games." Owen didn't move, didn't try to close the distance, understanding that, like a cornered animal, she needed space more than she needed comfort. "No one is here but us," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "And the dogs, they're under the table, fed and watered." He placed the mug on a low wooden table and stepped back, giving her a wide berth. I'm not a collector. I'm just a farmer who doesn't like seeing folks starve. Drink the broth. You passed out." The hours that followed were a tense negotiation of trust. Emma drank the soup, her body weeping with gratitude for the warmth, while her eyes never left Owen. He moved with a ghostly quietness for such a big man, tending to small tasks, oiling a hinge, stacking firewood, with a mechanical precision that suggested he was trying to keep his hands busy to silence his mind. Outside, the gray sky finally surrendered to the weight it had been carrying, and night fell with a bruised purple hue, bringing with it a storm that had been brewing over the mountains for days. It started as a whisper of rain against the glass, but quickly escalated into a tempest, the wind howling around the eaves of the farmhouse like a grieving spirit. The atmospheric pressure in the cabin dropped, and the air grew thick with static. Under the heavy oak dining table, Luna, the cream-colored female puppy, began to whine, a high-pitched, distressing sound. She was terrified of the noise, her small body shaking so violently that her teeth chattered. Emma slid off the couch and crawled under the table to comfort her, but as a crack of thunder split the sky directly overhead, shaking the very foundation of the house, it wasn't the dog she needed to worry about. The thunderclap acted as a violent key, unlocking a door in Owen's mind that he fought every day to keep shut. To Emma, it was just a noise. To Owen, it was the mortar shell that had taken out his convoy in Kandahar. It was the sound of the world ending. He froze in the middle of the kitchen, his eyes losing focus, the steel blue turning glassy and distant as the cozy farmhouse dissolved into sand and blood. He wasn't in Wyoming anymore. He was back in the sandbox, smelling cordite and burning diesel. His breathing became erratic, shallow gasps that sounded like he was drowning in air. He sank to the floor, his back pressing against the cabinets, his hands gripping his knees so hard his knuckles turned white. But the horror wasn't just the war. The storm twisted the knife of his grief for Sarah. It was on a night like this, with rain lashing the windshield, that the car had hydroplaned. The screech of metal, the silence afterward. The thunder became the crash. The lightning became the headlights. He was trapped in a dual nightmare, a paralyzed giant besieged by ghosts on two fronts, shaking with the tremors of a man whose nervous system was misfiring under the weight of unprocessed trauma. Emma peered out from under the table, holding the shivering Luna against her chest. She saw Owen, this mountain of a man who had seemed so invincible hours ago, crumpled on the floor, his eyes wide with the terror she recognized because she saw it in the mirror every day. It was the look of someone who had nowhere left to run. "Owen," she whispered, but he didn't hear her. He was listening to the screams of dying men. Compassion overrode her fear. Clutching Luna, who was still whimpering, Emma crawled across the floorboards toward him. Bear, the chocolate male puppy, trotted beside her, his tail low but his demeanor alert. He seemed to sense the change in the room's energy, the shift from physical danger to emotional collapse. Emma stopped a few feet from Owen. "It's just the rain," she said softly, her voice trembling but clear. "Just rain and wind. You're here. You're safe." She nudged Luna forward. The little female dog, seeking her own comfort, crawled into the space between Owen's legs and buried her nose in his stomach, her trembling body acting as a grounding wire. But it was Bear who made the connection. The bold puppy stepped up to Owen's clenched fist and licked his knuckles, a wet, rough sensation that cut through the sensory overload of the flashback. Owen blinked, the 1,000-yard stare fracturing as he looked down. He saw the puppy, felt the warmth of Luna against his core, and looked up to see Emma's hazel eyes, filled not with judgment, but with a profound, shared understanding of what it meant to be broken. The storm raged outside, but inside the kitchen, the 3 damaged souls and their 2 canine companions formed a silent, fragile circle of survival. The silence that had entombed Owen's farmhouse for 3 years began to crack, not with a sudden shatter, but with the slow, persistent erosion of life returning to its halls. Over the next week, a fragile rhythm established itself, a dance of avoidance and coexistence that slowly morphed into something resembling a household. Emma, though still jumpy at sudden movements, began to wage war against the dust and neglect that had settled over the cabin like a shroud since Sarah's death. She was small but possessed a nervous, wiry energy. Her hands, though roughened by her recent hardships, moved with a grace that turned chores into acts of reclamation. She scrubbed the grime from the windows until the Wyoming sun actually touched the floorboards again, and the kitchen, which had smelled only of stale coffee and indifference, began to fill with the scents of rosemary, roasted root vegetables, and bread. Simple meals made from the meager supplies Owen had, but prepared with a care that tasted like gratitude. Owen watched this transformation from the periphery, his large frame often lingering in the doorway, confused by the resurgence of domesticity. He wanted to hate it, to feel that his grief was being trespassed upon, but he found he couldn't. The house felt warmer, not just from the fire, but from the simple fact that he wasn't the only heart beating within its walls. It was during one of these evenings, while they sat at the heavy oak table eating a stew Emma had cobbled together, that the truth of her flight finally spilled out, painting the portrait of the man who had failed her. "His name is James," Emma said, staring into her bowl, her voice quiet but steadying itself on the facts. She described her father not as a monster, but as a man eroded by the slow attrition of failure. James was a man of soft edges and grand, impractical dreams, with thinning gray hair that he constantly raked through with nervous fingers and eyes that always looked wet, like a dog that expects to be kicked. He had loved his farm, but he loved the idea of it more than the work, and when the debts began to mount, spiraling into a mountain of red ink he couldn't climb, he turned to the kind of men who didn't use banks or lawyers. Emma described the change in him, the way he shrank into himself, the smell of cheap whiskey masking the scent of fear. "He didn't want to hurt me," she whispered, a tear tracing a clean line through the soot on her cheek. "He was just a coward. When the collectors came, the ones with the snake tattoos and the guns, they offered to wipe the slate clean. For me." She looked up at Owen then, her eyes hardening. James had agreed. He had wept while he did it, apologizing, claiming it was the only way to save their heritage, but he had agreed to hand his only daughter over to a fate worse than death to save his own skin. That night, Emma had packed a bag, taken Bear and Luna, the only innocent things left in that house, and ran into the dark, leaving her father to his shame. Owen listened, his jaw tightening until the muscles jumped. He knew men like James. He had seen them in war zones and in bars, men who let their fear dismantle their morality piece by piece until there was nothing left but a shell. As the days turned into a routine of work and recovery, a surprising dynamic began to unfold in the fields surrounding the house. While Luna preferred the safety of the porch, sticking close to Emma's shadow, Bear found his calling at Owen's heels. The chocolate puppy, rapidly growing into his paws, possessed an intelligence that bordered on uncanny. He didn't just follow, he observed. When Owen mended fences, Bear sat and watched the wire. When Owen checked the livestock, Bear mirrored his gait, a small, furry shadow to the giant ex-seal. The pivotal moment came on a Tuesday afternoon, under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Owen was working on the old International Harvester tractor, a rusting beast of iron that had been temperamental for a decade. He was deep in the engine block, wrestling with a seized piston, when he fired the ignition. The engine didn't catch smoothly. Instead, it backfired, a loud, explosive crack, followed by the rhythmic, deafening chug of the diesel engine struggling to turn over. The sound was too loud, too percussive. In an instant, the Wyoming field dissolved. The smell of diesel became the smell of a burning Humvee. The rhythmic chugging became the .50 caliber machine gun fire of an ambush. Owen froze, his wrench clattering to the ground, his breath seizing in his throat as the panic attack hit him like a physical blow, locking his muscles and tunneling his vision into a pinpoint of terror. He was vibrating, lost in the flashback, unaware of where he was until a sharp, demanding bark cut through the noise. Bear didn't run away from the noise or the terrifyingly large man who was hyperventilating. Instead, the puppy leaped. He jumped up, planting his front paws firmly on Owen's thigh, digging his small claws in just enough to cause a sting of pain, and barked again, loud, sharp, and right in Owen's face. When Owen didn't respond immediately, Bear jumped higher, nipping at Owen's gloved hand, forcing him to engage. The physical sensation broke the loop. Owen blinked, the desert fading, replaced by the sight of the chocolate puppy's intense, golden-brown eyes staring him down, tail wagging with urgent concern. Owen let out a shuddering breath, his hand instinctively coming down to rest on Bear's head. The dog leaned into the touch, solid and real, anchoring Owen back to the earth. "Okay," Owen breathed, his voice shaking. "I'm here. I'm okay." Bear licked his hand once, satisfied, and sat down, resuming his watch. Owen looked toward the house where he saw Emma watching from the window, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't feel the crushing weight of solitude. He realized with a start that the cold, dead space inside him was being colonized by these 3 refugees: a girl running from betrayal, a timid dog learning to trust, and a brave puppy who had just pulled a soldier back from the edge of hell. The fragility of the peace that had settled over the farmhouse was exposed on a Tuesday afternoon, shattered not by the violence of men with guns, but by the sharp, insidious tongue of a neighbor armed with nothing more than gossip. Owen had driven the truck into town to pick up the hydraulic pump for the tractor, leaving Emma alone with the dogs for the first time. The day was deceptively bright, the sun bleaching the color from the high desert grass, as Emma hung wet laundry on the line stretched between the porch and an old oak tree. She was humming a tune she hadn't remembered knowing, her movements light, almost happy, until the crunch of tires on gravel announced an arrival. A battered Ford pickup, colored a faded, sickly green, rolled up the driveway and came to a halt with a shuddering cough of its engine. The driver's door creaked open, and out stepped Samuel, the nearest neighbor, a man who wore his curiosity like a second skin. Samuel was in his late 50s, a man whose body had gone soft around the middle, giving him the appearance of a sack of grain left out in the rain too long. He had a receding hairline that he tried desperately to conceal with wisps of gray, oily hair combed severely across his spotted scalp, and his face was dominated by a pair of pale, watery blue eyes that seemed to magnify everything they looked at, stripping away privacy and dignity. He walked with a slight limp that he often exaggerated when he wanted sympathy. Wiping his hands on trousers that were pulled up too high, his gaze immediately locking onto Emma with a mixture of lasciviousness and judgment. Bear, sensing an intruder who didn't smell right, let out a low, rumbling growl from the porch, his hackles raised, but Samuel ignored the dog, leaning casually against the fence post as if he owned the view. "So," he drawled, his voice nasally and grating like sandpaper on glass, "the rumors are true. Owen's got himself a house guest." Emma froze, a wet shirt clutched to her chest like a shield. I'm just helping out," she stammered, intimidated by the man's invasive stare. Samuel chuckled, a wet, unpleasant sound. "Helping out. Is that what we're calling it now? You know, folks in town are talking. They see Owen buying extra supplies, see a woman's silhouette in the window. It doesn't look good, Missy. Not good at all." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. "You probably don't know, being a drifter and all, but Sarah, that was his wife. She was a saint. Died tragic. Owen, he's a hero, a grieving man. And here you are, barely a ghost in her house, playing wife." The words hit Emma like physical blows. "It's not like that," she whispered, her face burning. Samuel leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that felt more like a threat. "Doesn't matter what it is, matters what it looks like. You think you're helping him? You're dragging his name through the mud. A man like that, with a reputation, He doesn't need a stray girl and her mutts bringing trouble to his door. And you do have trouble written all over you, girl. I can smell it. Debt, maybe? Running from the law? Whatever it is, when it catches up to you, it'll be Owen who pays the price. You really want to be the reason he loses everything he has left? Samuel didn't stay long after that, just long enough to plant the seeds of shame and fear deep in the fertile soil of Emma's insecurity, before driving off in a cloud of dust, satisfied with his day's work. When Owen returned hours later, oblivious and carrying a bag of groceries, the house was quiet. Emma was there, cooking dinner, but the light had gone out of her eyes. She moved mechanically, avoiding his gaze, every word Samuel had said replaying in her mind on an agonizing loop. She looked at Owen, this strong, broken, kind man who had asked for nothing, and saw herself through Samuel's eyes. A parasite, a scandal, a danger. She thought of the debt collectors, the violence that followed her like a shadow. Samuel was right. It was only a matter of time before they found her, and if they found her here, they would hurt Owen. They would burn down the sanctuary he had built. She couldn't let that happen. She loved him, or at least she loved the safety he represented, too much to destroy him. Midnight came with a suffocating silence. The farmhouse breathed slowly, the timbers settling in the cool night air. Emma moved like a phantom in the dark, packing her meager belongings into the same battered bag she had arrived with. Her hands trembled as she wrote the note on a scrap of paper by the moonlight filtering through the kitchen window. "Thank you for saving me. I can't let you save me anymore. You deserve peace, not the storm I bring. Please don't look for me." She left the paper on the kitchen table, weighted down by the salt shaker. Then she woke the dogs. Luna, sleepy and confused, whined softly, but Emma shushed her with a desperate finger to her lips. Bear was more reluctant. He looked from the door to the hallway where Owen slept, his tail low, sensing the wrongness of this departure. He nudged Emma's hand as if asking her to stay, to wake the big man who fixed things. "We have to go, Bear," she whispered, tears finally spilling over, hot and fast. "We have to save him." With a heavy heart that felt like it was breaking all over again, she clipped the leashes on. They slipped out the back door into the vast, indifferent night, walking away from the only home they had known, heading back toward the lights of the town and the danger that waited there, leaving Owen alone with his ghosts once more. The road leading back to town was a desolate ribbon of cracked asphalt swallowed by the ink-black night, illuminated only by the indifferent gaze of the moon which seemed to mock Emma's solitary march. She had barely covered 3 miles, her boots dragging with the weight of her sacrifice, when the blinding beams of headlights cut through the darkness like predatory eyes. Before she could scramble into the ditch, a black van screeched to a halt beside her, the sliding door tearing open to reveal the very demons she had spent weeks running from. There was no time to scream, no time to fight. Rough hands grabbed her, dragging her and the yelping dogs inside with a brutal efficiency that spoke of practice. The bag she carried was tossed in after her, landing with a dull thud next to Luna, who was shivering so violently she looked like a blurred photograph. The drive was short and silent, ending at a derelict sawmill on the edge of the forest, a skeletal structure of rotting wood and rusted sheet metal that smelled of damp decay and old gasoline. Inside, the space was cavernous and lit by a single, flickering bulb that cast long, dancing shadows against the walls, revealing the nightmare waiting for her. In the center of the room, bound to a wooden chair with thick zip ties, sat her father, James. He looked even more wretched than Emma remembered. His thinning gray hair was matted with sweat and blood, his face a map of bruises, and his wet, dog-like eyes were wide with a terror that hadn't broken him, but rather hollowed him out. Standing over him was Vargas, the man whose name had whispered through their lives like a curse. Vargas was a man of sharp, unpleasant angles, tall and wiry like a starved wolf, with skin the color of old parchment and a thin, precise scar running from the corner of his mouth to his ear, giving him a perpetual, ghastly grin. He wore a suit that was too expensive for the setting, pristine and sharp, contrasting with the filth around him. He didn't look at Emma with lust or anger, but with the cold, calculating appraisal of an accountant looking at a ledger that finally balanced. "The prodigal daughter," Vargas said, his voice smooth and dry like rustling leaves. "Your father said you'd come back, eventually." Emma rushed toward James, falling to her knees, expecting an apology, a hug, some flicker of parental instinct. Instead, James recoiled, his eyes darting to Vargas. "Emma," he blubbered, saliva gathering at the corners of his mouth. "You're here. Thank God. You can fix this. Just do what Mr. Vargas says. Please, baby. They're going to kill me. Just go with him. Work it off. It won't be forever." The words hit Emma harder than any fist. She pulled back, looking at the man who had raised her, seeing not a victim, but a creature consumed by his own survival instinct. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was offering her up as a sacrificial lamb to save his own skin, bargaining her life for his debts without a shred of hesitation. The betrayal was absolute. A cold knife in her gut that killed the last lingering hope that she had a family to return to. Vargas stepped forward, nudging James with the toe of his polished shoe to silence him. "Touching," he sneered, then turned his attention to the whimpering basket. "But I don't run a kennel. The girl stays. The mutts go. Sell them to the fighting pits or drown them in the river. I don't care. Just get them out of my sight." A heavy-set henchman, a brute of a man named Crunk with a neck as thick as a tree stump and knuckles tattooed with faded letters, lumbered forward. He reached down, his massive hand closing around the scruff of Luna's neck. Luna froze, paralyzed by fear, going limp as she was hoisted into the air. But as Crunk reached for the second dog, the dynamic in the room shifted explosively. Bear was not Luna. The chocolate puppy, though young, had the heart of a guardian and the instincts of a predator honing its skills. He didn't cower. As the massive hand descended, Bear launched himself upward with a snarl that sounded far too big for his chest. His jaws, lined with sharp puppy teeth, clamped down hard on the fleshy webbing between Crunk's thumb and forefinger. Crunk howled, a sound of shock and pain, and violently thrashed his arm. "Get off, you little rat!" he roared, slinging his arm wide. The force of the motion sent Bear flying across the room, but the puppy twisted in midair with cat-like agility. He didn't hit the wall. He crashed into a low, grime-covered window, the rotten frame and brittle glass shattering on impact. Bear tumbled out into the darkness of the forest, rolling into the brush. Inside, silence held for a heartbeat. Vargas looked at the broken window, then at Crunk, who was clutching his bleeding hand. "Idiot," Vargas hissed. "Go get it. Or shoot it. I don't care." Crunk grabbed a pistol from his belt and ran out the side door, cursing into the night. Emma, pinned to the floor by another guard, clutched the trembling Luna to her chest, her face pressed into the dog's fur to stifle her sobs. She was trapped, betrayed by her father, and in the hands of monsters. But as she listened to the sounds of the heavy boots stomping through the underbrush outside, fading away without the sharp crack of a gunshot, a tiny, desperate ember of hope ignited in the ashes of her despair. Bear was out there. He was smart, he was fast, and he was free. And she prayed to a God she wasn't sure was listening that the brave little dog would run far, far away, even if it meant she would never see him again. The silence in the farmhouse was different this time. It wasn't the heavy, stagnant silence of grief that Owen had lived with for 3 years, but the sharp, vacuous silence of a sudden amputation. Owen stood in the kitchen, the crumpled note in his massive hand, his knuckles white as the paper groaned under the pressure. He didn't need to guess who had driven her away. The stench of Samuel's self-righteous poison hung in the air, a spiritual residue that made Owen's lip curl in a snarl that would have terrified the older man. But there was no time for retribution, not yet. His internal clock, honed by years of high-stakes operations where seconds measured the distance between life and death, was ticking loudly. He was moving toward the door, keys in hand, when a frantic scratching and a guttural, desperate bark erupted from the front porch. Owen threw the door open to find Bear, the chocolate puppy, collapsing on the welcome mat. The dog was a ruin of his former self. His coat was matted with burrs and mud, and a long, jagged gash ran down his flank where the window glass had sliced him, bleeding sluggishly onto the wood. But the fire in the animal's amber eyes hadn't dimmed. Seeing Owen, Bear didn't whimper for comfort. He scrambled up on trembling legs, grabbed the cuff of Owen's jeans with his teeth, and tugged violently toward the driveway, letting out a sharp, demanding bark that translated across species barriers with crystal clarity. She is in trouble. Follow me. In that instant, the farmer died, and the soldier was resurrected. Owen didn't waste a second questioning the dog's intelligence. He recognized the look of a teammate signaling an extraction. He moved to the gun safe in the study, spinning the dial with muscle memory that bypassed conscious thought. He pulled out a Mossberg 590 tactical shotgun and a hunting knife with a 6-inch serrated blade, strapping the sheath to his belt. He didn't look like a broken widower anymore. As he checked the chamber of the shotgun, the dull click-clack echoing in the room, his face settled into a mask of cold, predatory focus. The face of a man who had hunted insurgents in the Hindu Kush. He carried Bear to the truck, placing the injured dog on the passenger seat. "Show me," Owen commanded, his voice devoid of emotion. As the truck roared to life, Bear pressed his nose against the glass, whining and pointing his muzzle toward the dark logging road that led to the old timberlands. They drove in darkness, headlights off, guided only by the moonlight and Bear's agitated directions. When they reached the perimeter of the derelict sawmill, Bear began to growl low in his throat, the hair on his back standing up like wire. Owen killed the engine and rolled the truck into the brush. He looked at the dog. "Stay," he ordered. Bear, exhausted and bleeding, obeyed, slumping against the door as his duty was done. Now it was the Reaper's turn. Owen moved through the woods with a terrifying silence, a shadow detaching itself from the night. The sawmill was poorly guarded. These were thugs used to intimidating debtors, not soldiers expecting a Tier 1 operator. A lone sentry stood by the side door, smoking a cigarette, the cherry glowing in the dark. Owen approached from the blind side, moving with the deceptive speed of a striking cobra. One hand clamped over the man's mouth, the other applied pressure to the carotid artery. The guard went limp in seconds, unconscious before he hit the ground. Owen stepped over the body, stacking up against the doorframe, listening. He heard Vargas's dry, mocking voice and the sound of a woman weeping. The rage that had been simmering in Owen's gut flash-froze into a calculating, icy resolve. He didn't kick the door down. He opened it softly, the rusty hinges groaning just enough to turn heads, but by then it was too late. The chaos that followed was brief and brutal. Owen entered the room not as a man, but as a force of nature. Crunk, the massive henchman, was the first to react, reaching for the pistol in his belt. Owen didn't hesitate. He racked the shotgun, the sound alone freezing the room, and fired a warning shot into the ceiling, raining dust and plaster down on them. "On the ground!" Owen's voice was a thunderclap, projecting command presence that brooked no argument. Crunk hesitated, his primitive brain calculating odds, so Owen stepped forward and drove the butt of the shotgun into the man's solar plexus, folding him like a cheap lawn chair, then followed with a swift kick to the temple that sent the giant into oblivion. Vargas, the wolf-like leader, looked at his fallen muscle, then at the barrel of the shotgun leveled at his chest, and his arrogant grin vanished. He raised his hands slowly, his face paling to the color of ash. "Just business," Vargas stammered, his smooth veneer cracking. "We're just doing business." Owen ignored him, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Emma. She was huddled in the corner, clutching a trembling Luna, her eyes wide with disbelief as she looked at the man she thought was a simple farmer. And in the far corner, cowering behind a stack of rotting pallets, was James. The older man was trembling, not with relief, but with the pathetic terror of a man who knows he has been exposed. Owen moved to Emma, keeping the weapon trained on Vargas. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice softening just a fraction. She nodded, sobbing, and buried her face in his jacket. "Bear?" she whispered. "In the truck," Owen replied. "Alive." He looked at James, who was trying to make himself invisible. "And you," Owen said, his voice dripping with disgust. "You're coming too, but not for your sake." He marched them out, leaving the unconscious Crunk and the terrified Vargas in the ruins of their stronghold, the night air filling with the promise of a reckoning that was just beginning. 6 months had passed since the violent night at the sawmill, and the Wyoming summer had descended upon Owen's ranch, transforming the desolate landscape of winter into a vibrant tapestry of emerald grasses and wildflowers that swayed under the warm, golden sun. The farmhouse, once a silent mausoleum to grief, now hummed with the chaotic, beautiful rhythm of life, its windows thrown open to catch the breeze carrying the scent of blooming sage and freshly turned earth. In the yard, the transformation was most evident in the 4-legged guardians who patrolled the perimeter. Bear was no longer the clumsy chocolate puppy who had tripped over his own paws. He had grown into a magnificent creature, a 70-pound muscular adolescent with a coat that gleamed like burnished mahogany and a chest broad enough to break a charging bull's momentum. He moved with a regal, predatory grace, his amber eyes missing nothing, taking his role as the farm's protector with a seriousness that made the local coyotes give the property a wide berth. Beside him, Luna had undergone a quieter but no less miraculous metamorphosis. The creamy white female, once a trembling leaf of a dog who wetted herself at the sound of a raised voice, now trotted with her tail held high, a plume of confidence. While she still sought the comfort of the porch during the worst thunderstorms, she no longer hid under the bed. Instead, she would lean against Bear's solid flank, drawing courage from his stoic presence until the noise passed, a testament to the healing power of safety and consistency. The specter of the past had been exorcised, though not forgotten. The evidence Owen had provided to the state police, ledgers found in the sawmill and his own eyewitness testimony, had been enough to dismantle Vargas's operation, sending the scar-faced man and his brute enforcer, Crunk, to the state penitentiary for a long list of felonies ranging from extortion to kidnapping. Justice had been swift, a clean cut to remove the rot. As for James, his path was rockier, but finally heading uphill. He was currently residing in a court-mandated rehabilitation center 3 counties over, trading his addiction and cowardice for hard labor and sobriety. Emma visited him every Sunday, driving Owen's truck with a newfound independence. She had forgiven him, an act of grace that Owen marveled at, but she had also drawn a line in the sand as sharp as a razor. She loved her father, but she would not live with him, nor would she ever again let his debts become her chains. She had found her own footing, her frame filling out with the healthy strength of farm work, her hazel eyes clear and bright, no longer darting to the exits but holding a steady, confident gaze that challenged the world to try and break her again. Even the social landscape of their small corner of the world had shifted. One humid afternoon, the familiar, sickly green Ford pickup truck rumbled up the driveway. But this time, Samuel didn't lean against the fence with a sneer. The older neighbor climbed out slowly, holding a basket of peaches from his orchard like a peace offering to an angry god. He looked smaller, his bluster deflated by the reality of what had happened. He had heard the full story of the kidnapping, of Owen's heroism, and of the danger he had almost caused with his loose tongue. He approached Emma, who was weeding the vegetable garden, his watery blue eyes looking at his boots. "I brought these for Cobbler," he muttered, his voice lacking its usual grating edge. "And to say I was wrong. About you, about everything. A man gets old, he gets bitter, starts seeing dirt where there's only dust. I'm sorry, miss, you're good for this place." Good for him. Emma, wiping dirt from her hands, didn't lash out. She simply took the basket and nodded, accepting the apology not for his sake, but to clear the air for the future. Samuel drove away, and though he remained a gossip, his stories about the Cartwright Ranch changed tone, shifting from scandal to a kind of reverent folklore about the soldier and the girl who saved each other. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised purples and fiery oranges, Owen and Emma stood in the garden behind the house. This plot of land had been Sarah's pride, but for 3 years it had been a tangle of weeds and dead stalks. Now it was reborn. Together they had tilled the soil, pulling out the old roots to make room for new life, hardy perennials, vibrant cosmos, and rows of vegetables that promised a harvest. Owen paused, leaning on his shovel, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at Emma, who was kneeling in the dirt, her hands gentle as she patted soil around a young rosebush. He looked at Bear, who was lying in the grass chewing on a stick, and Luna, chasing a moth in the twilight. The silence between them was comfortable, heavy with things that didn't need to be said, but Owen felt the need to speak them anyway. "You know," he said, his voice deep and rough like the earth he worked. "I thought I was just doing a duty that day at the market, paying a debt to the universe." Emma stood up, brushing off her knees, and walked over to him. "You did more than that, Owen. You saved us. You saved Bear, Luna. You saved me." Owen shook his head slowly, stepping closer, his large hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "No," he corrected her, his steel-blue eyes soft and vulnerable in a way no one else had ever seen. "Bear saved you. He's the hero. But you and those dogs, you came into this tomb and opened the windows. You made me remember I was still alive. You saved my soul, Emma." Tears pricked Emma's eyes, but she smiled, a radiant expression that outshone the sunset. She reached up, pulling his face down to hers. They kissed as the last light of day faded, a promise sealed not in blood or debt, but in love and soil. Around them, the fireflies began to dance, and Bear lifted his head, thumping his tail once against the ground, a rhythmic, steady heartbeat of a family made whole, ready to face whatever storms the future might hold, together. The story of Owen, Emma, and their faithful companions serves as a powerful testament that God's miracles are not always found in grand, thunderous events, but often in the quiet, perfectly timed intersection of broken paths. It teaches us that when we feel most abandoned, we are often being positioned for a rescue we cannot yet see, just as a grieving soldier was saved by the loyalty of a stray dog. In your own daily life, do not lose faith when the storms rage, for your greatest blessing may be waiting just around the corner, disguised as a challenge or a helping hand. We hope this narrative has renewed your spirit and reminded you that it is never too late to rebuild. Please support our mission by subscribing to the channel, sharing this video with those who need encouragement, and leaving a comment below. May God bless you abundantly and keep you safe.